In the spring of 1924, the gardens of the Biltmore estate were arranged with the kind of precision that takes months to plan and an army of staff to execute. 8,000 guests received invitations. The roads leading into Asheville, North Carolina, filled with automobiles. Newspapers from New York to London sent correspondence. The wedding of Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was, by almost every available measure, one of the most elaborately staged social events the American South had ever witnessed. Cornelia was 23 years old. She stood in a dress that had been designed around her, in a house that had been built around her family, on an estate that employed more people than most small towns. Every visible element of that day had been arranged, approved, and managed by someone else. The groom, John Francis Amherst Cecil, was a British aristocrat of modest means and considerable pedigree. The match had taken years to arrange. What the newspaper photographs captured was a young woman surrounded by everything: flowers, family, fortune, staff, spectators, looking, in most of them, somewhere just past the camera. Within a decade, she would be gone, not dead, not disgraced, simply absent. The estate would remain. The husband would remain. The children would remain. Cornelia Vanderbilt would cross the Atlantic and, with remarkable thoroughness, not come back. This is the story of what happened before that and what that leaving cost, not only her, but everyone who stayed. George Washington Vanderbilt II broke ground on his Asheville estate in 1889. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and in possession of a fortune inherited from his grandfather, William Henry Vanderbilt, who had himself inherited and then doubled the original accumulation of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch who had clawed his way from Staten Island ferry operator to the most powerful railroad magnate in American history. By the time the money reached George, it had passed through enough hands that it no longer carried the smell of labor. It had become simply a condition of existence. George was the youngest of 8 children and by most accounts the least interested in business. He read widely, collected art, studied multiple languages, and spent his inheritance not on railroads or steel or any of the productive machinery of the Gilded Age, but on land, specifically on 125,000 acres of western North Carolina mountain terrain, and on the construction of a house so large that the word house no longer quite applied. Biltmore, named partly for the Dutch village of Bilt, ancestral home of the Vanderbilts, took 6 years to build. At its completion in 1895, it contained 250 rooms. It had been designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America. Its grounds had been landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park. Nothing about it was accidental, and nothing about it was modest. George Vanderbilt moved in largely alone. He had a staff, of course, dozens of them, then hundreds. He had tenants on the surrounding farmland, a working dairy, a forestry program that became one of the first managed forests in the United States. He had guests on occasion, prominent ones, the kind whose names appeared in the social registers of New York and Boston and Washington. But for most of the year, Biltmore was occupied by one man, an enormous staff, and an accumulation of objects: tapestries, paintings, books, porcelain, carved ceilings, that together represented not so much a life as an archive. In 1898, George Vanderbilt married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman of old family and refined social instinct. She was 31. He was 40. They had known each other for some years through the overlapping social circuits of New York and Paris, and the marriage was understood by those who observed it as a practical and well-matched arrangement. Edith brought to Biltmore something it had been missing: a social intelligence, a managerial precision, and a willingness to engage with the estate as a functioning household rather than a private retreat. Cornelia was born on August 22, 1900. She was their only child. The timing of her birth placed her at an odd intersection of circumstances. The Vanderbilt fortune, though still immense by any ordinary standard, had been significantly reduced from its peak. The original Cornelius Vanderbilt had left somewhere between $100 and $105 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1877. By the time it reached George, divided among children and grandchildren and subjected to the ordinary entropy of inherited wealth, it had narrowed considerably. George himself had spent with a consistency that alarmed his financial advisors. Biltmore alone had cost somewhere between $5 and $7 million to build, with ongoing maintenance costs that the estate's agricultural operations could not come close to covering. When Cornelia arrived, the house was already, in a quiet financial sense, a problem dressed as a triumph. She was given the name Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, carrying both the Dutch colonial weight of the Stuyvesant line through her mother and the industrial dynasty weight of the Vanderbilt name through her father. Two of the oldest and most prominent names in American social history pressed into a single infant. There were no siblings. There would not be. All of whatever remained, the estate, the name, the obligation, would fall to her alone. George Vanderbilt died in February 1914. Cornelia was 13 years old. He had gone to Washington for what was described as a minor surgical procedure. It was, in fact, an appendectomy. And in 1914, even routine surgeries carried risks that modern medicine has since largely eliminated. He did not recover. He was 51 years old. He had owned Biltmore for less than 20 years and had spent a significant portion of the family's remaining fortune in the process of maintaining it. The estate passed to Edith, held in trust for Cornelia until she came of age. What Cornelia inherited concretely was this: a 250-room house in the mountains of North Carolina, roughly 8,000 acres of remaining land after Edith had sold a portion to the federal government to help cover debts, a staff of somewhere between 80 and 100 people, depending on the season, a name that opened social doors while simultaneously narrowing personal ones, and no father. She was 13. She had spent her entire conscious life inside the physical and social architecture her father had constructed. The estate's rhythms, its seasonal staffing, its guest schedules, its agricultural operations, its maintenance demands had formed the background texture of everything she had ever known. The people she knew best were employees. The spaces she moved through daily were formal, managed, and designed for impression rather than comfort. Her world was, in the most literal sense, a curated environment. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore partly as an act of self-definition, a way of establishing, through stone and acreage and imported art, a particular kind of identity. Scholarly, cultivated, European in aspiration, removed from the more aggressive commercial energy of his family's origins. He had succeeded architecturally. Whether he had succeeded personally is harder to assess. The house he left behind was magnificent and largely impractical, admired by visitors and quietly consuming by the accounting of anyone who had to maintain it. Cornelia did not choose any of it. She was born into a finished argument, a statement already made in limestone and carved oak and Flemish tapestries about what kind of people the Vanderbilts were, or wished to be seen as. Her role, as it would gradually become clear, was not to add to that statement, but to carry it forward. To be, in the language of dynasty, a continuation. She was 13 years old, her father was dead, and the house, all 250 rooms of it, was now, in some essential legal and social sense, hers. Edith Vanderbilt did not grieve visibly. This was not unusual for a woman of her background and generation. Public emotional display was considered a kind of failure, a lapse in the self-management that distinguished the well-bred from everyone else. What she did instead, within months of George's death in 1914, was begin the work of securing what remained. She sold approximately 120,000 acres of the original Biltmore land to the federal government for $5 an acre, a transaction that would eventually become part of the Pisgah National Forest. It was a practical decision made under financial pressure, and Edith executed it with the same precision she brought to everything else. The house would survive. The land would go. Then she turned her attention to Cornelia. Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a woman of considerable capability. She managed the Biltmore estate through the difficult years following George's death with a competence that surprised people who had assumed a wealthy widow would simply retreat. She oversaw the agricultural operations, managed the staff, maintained the social obligations of the estate, and handled the financial decisions that a house of that scale required continuously. She was also, in ways that mattered more to Cornelia's story, a woman who understood social position as something that had to be actively maintained, that it did not simply persist on its own, but required constant management, correct presentation, and the disciplined avoidance of anything that might invite unfavorable interpretation. Cornelia's education was arranged accordingly. There were tutors rather than schools. This was standard practice for girls of Cornelia's class, but at Biltmore, it had a particular texture. The estate's remoteness from Asheville and Asheville's remoteness from the social centers where the Vanderbilt name actually carried weight meant that Cornelia's educational world was almost entirely contained within the estate's grounds. The tutors came to her. The lessons happened in rooms designed for other purposes. Sitting rooms, libraries, spaces furnished for adult occupation rather than childhood learning. The other students, when there were any, were daughters of families Edith considered appropriate, brought in for specific periods, and then gone. What this arrangement produced was a girl who was, by her early teenage years, extraordinarily well acquainted with formal adult spaces and deeply unfamiliar with the ordinary social texture of childhood. She knew how to move through Biltmore's rooms with the right kind of ease, the unhurried, unstartled ease of someone who has never had to navigate those rooms as a guest. She knew the names of the staff, the rhythms of the seasonal household, the appropriate behavior at a formal dinner table. What she had very little experience of was the unmanaged, unsupervised social world in which most children learn through friction and failure how other people work. Edith also managed Cornelia's presentation with considerable attention. Photographs from Cornelia's adolescence show a girl dressed with the kind of care that communicates status before a word is spoken. The clothes are correct. The posture is correct. The setting is always one that reinforces the Vanderbilt context. There is very little in these images that looks accidental. Edith understood with the clarity of someone who had married into a dynasty rather than been born into one, that the Vanderbilt name in the early 20th century was already beginning to require maintenance in a way it had not a generation before. The original fortune was fracturing across too many heirs. The social world was shifting. The families that had once defined American aristocracy were finding that definition increasingly contested. Cornelia was, in this context, both Edith's daughter and Edith's project. The two roles were never cleanly separated. In 1916, Edith began taking Cornelia to Washington with some regularity. Edith had developed a social circle there that included political figures and old family names, and she began the careful work of placing Cornelia within those circles at an age when first impressions were still being formed. Cornelia was 15, 16, moving through Washington drawing rooms in the company of her mother, being introduced and assessed and filed away in the social memory of people who would, in a few years, be relevant to her prospects. There is a photograph from a Washington social event in 1917, when Cornelia was 16. She is standing beside her mother, dressed appropriately, looking directly at the camera with an expression that is difficult to read. Not unhappy exactly, not uncomfortable exactly, but there is something in it, a quality of stillness that seems less like composure and more like the particular blankness of someone who has learned to give nothing away, because the environment has never been safe for spontaneity. Whether Edith recognized this is not clear from any surviving record. What is clear is that Edith's management of Cornelia extended to the question of marriage with an intention that became more structured as Cornelia moved through her late teens. Edith had her own experience as a guide here. She had married George Vanderbilt at 31, a late marriage by the standards of her era, and she understood the social mathematics of how a woman's position was calculated in relation to her marital status. Cornelia was an only heir to an estate and a name. The right marriage would secure both. The wrong one, or no marriage at the right time, carried risks that Edith took seriously. By the time Cornelia was 18 and 19, Edith was navigating the social landscape of eligible men with the focus of someone managing an important and time-sensitive transaction. The war had altered things. Many of the young men of the appropriate class had gone to Europe, some had not returned, and the social field had been reshuffled in ways that complicated the usual calculations. But Edith was methodical. She moved in the right circles, maintained the right correspondences, and kept Cornelia visible in the right rooms. Cornelia, for her part, was 20 years old in 1920, living in a 250-room house in North Carolina, Under her mother's careful supervision, her days structured around the requirements of the estate and the social calendar Edith maintained. Her own preferences, what she actually wanted, what she found interesting, what kind of life she might have imagined for herself if imagining had been encouraged, do not appear in any surviving document from this period to have been a primary consideration in the planning. The Biltmore estate in the early 1920s employed somewhere between 80 and 300 people, depending on the season and the work being counted. There were household staff, butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, laundresses, chambermaids, whose numbers swelled when guests arrived and contracted during the quieter months. There were estate workers who managed the dairy, the farm operations, the poultry, the forests, and the grounds. There were craftsmen who maintained the building itself, because a structure of that size required continuous attention. Roofs, plumbing, heating systems, stonework, the thousand small deteriorations that a house accumulates when it is too large for any single person to monitor completely. Cornelia grew up among all of them, and at a remove from all of them. This was not cruelty, it was architecture, social architecture as deliberate as the building itself. The staff knew their work, knew their positions, and knew the invisible lines that structured every interaction with the family. Cornelia, from childhood, knew those lines too. She had learned them the way children learn most things, not through instruction, but through observation, through the small corrections that happened when a line was approached too casually, through the gradual internalization of a system so consistent it eventually stopped being visible as a system at all. What this meant practically was that Cornelia spent her formative years surrounded by people she could not be close to, not because they were unkind. The surviving accounts from former Biltmore staff from this period are almost uniformly warm in their descriptions of Cornelia as a child and young woman. She is remembered as curious, occasionally mischievous, genuinely interested in the work happening around her. She would appear in the kitchens. She would spend time near the dairy operations. She once, according to one account, spent an entire afternoon in the estate's greenhouse with one of the gardeners, learning the names of plants with an attention that surprised him. But these were visits. She could leave, they could not, and everyone involved understood that distinction without it needing to be spoken. The social world that Biltmore could offer Cornelia was, by design, a limited one. Edith maintained a guest list of appropriate families, and there were visits, extended stays by people whose names and backgrounds had been vetted against the standards Edith applied to all social contact. These guests brought their own children sometimes, and Cornelia moved among them during those periods with what the historical record suggests was a careful, slightly formal sociability. She was not unfriendly, she was not cold, but the accounts from people who encountered her during this period carry a consistent note. She was pleasant and contained, engaged enough that no one felt dismissed, but rarely the kind of present that made another person feel genuinely reached. This is not a surprising outcome for a child raised in managed spaces. When every environment has been arranged in advance, when every social encounter has been pre-screened for appropriateness, the ordinary skills of unscripted human contact, the ability to be awkward without consequence, to misread someone and recover, to want something openly without knowing if you'll get it, do not develop in the same way. They develop through exposure to situations where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, where no one has arranged things to be comfortable. Biltmore's grounds offered Cornelia another kind of education, less social and more sensory. The estate was, by any measure, a remarkable physical environment. The gardens, formal, walled, seasonal, were maintained to a standard that required constant expert attention. The surrounding forests, still extensive despite Edith's land sale, were managed under the forestry principles that Gifford Pinchot had helped establish during George Vanderbilt's ownership. The Blue Ridge Mountains formed the backdrop to everything, present in every long view from the house's terraces and windows. Cornelia spent a great deal of time outdoors. She rode horses. This was both an accomplishment expected of women of her class and, at Biltmore, a practical way of moving through the estate's acreage. She walked the grounds with a freedom of movement that the house itself, with its formal rooms and managed spaces, did not quite offer. There is something in the accounts of her outdoor habits that suggests the land gave her something the house could not. An environment where the management was botanical rather than social, where her presence did not require the constant small adjustments of comportment that the house demanded. But the land, too, was not simply land. It was property. Every path she walked on, every view she looked at, was owned. The farmers and tenant workers she passed were there because of arrangements her family had made. The forest was managed according to a program her father had initiated. Even her solitude outdoors was structured by ownership in ways that would have been difficult at 16 or 17 to think clearly about. And in any case, the education she was receiving gave her no particular tools for that kind of thinking. In 1919, Edith arranged for Cornelia to be presented at court in London. This was a formal social ritual, the presentation of debutantes to the British royal family that American families of sufficient wealth and social ambition had been participating in for decades. It required the right connections, the right dress, the right manner, and above all, the right name. The Vanderbilt name was sufficient. Cornelia was 18, dressed in the prescribed white, and presented in a ceremony whose purpose was precisely what it appeared to be, the formal introduction of a young woman of good family into the marriage market of the transatlantic upper class. She returned to Biltmore afterward. The presentation had gone correctly. No incident, no embarrassment, the right impressions made in the right rooms. Edith had achieved what she set out to achieve. Cornelia had been seen by the people who needed to see her. What the London presentation had also done, though no one appears to have framed it this way at the time, was introduce Cornelia to a social world that operated on a different scale and rhythm than Western North Carolina. A world of old titles, European capitals, and a kind of inherited ease that even Biltmore, for all its aspirations, could not quite replicate. She had been shown something. She had then been brought back. John Francis Amherst Cecil arrived in Cornelia's life through the kind of social engineering that left very few fingerprints. He did not appear suddenly. He was not introduced at a single decisive dinner and then pursued. He materialized gradually through the overlapping circuits of transatlantic society that Edith had been carefully cultivating since George's death. The London seasons, the Washington drawing rooms, the country house visits that structured the social calendar of families who moved between America and Britain with the ease of people for whom an ocean crossing was a logistical inconvenience rather than a significant journey. Cecil was the second son of Lord William Amherst Cecil, a British aristocrat whose family name carried centuries of English establishment weight. He had been educated at Eton and Oxford. He was, by the standards applied to such assessments, well-bred, presentable, and in possession of exactly the kind of lineage that old American money had been attempting to purchase through marriage since the 1870s, when the Vanderbilts' contemporaries, the Jeromes, the Belmonts, the Astors, had begun exporting their daughters to European aristocracy in exchange for titles, respectability, and the particular social legitimacy that industrial American fortunes, however vast, could not quite manufacture on their own. The Vanderbilts had participated in this exchange before. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Cornelia's cousin, had been famously and unhappily married to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, a transaction arranged by her mother Alva with a directness that Consuelo later described in terms that left little room for ambiguity about what the arrangement had cost her. That marriage had ended in separation and eventual divorce, producing in the process a minor scandal and a major cautionary example of what happened when the human element was managed too aggressively. Edith was more careful, or perhaps more patient. The distinction matters less than the outcome. Cecil had modest financial resources of his own. This was common among younger sons of British aristocratic families, whose inheritance structures directed the bulk of family wealth to the eldest son and left the others with a name, an education, and the expectation that they would find their own way. What Cecil needed in the cold language of social arithmetic was money. What the Vanderbilt estate needed, in the same language, was a certain kind of management, someone who could occupy the position of male heir to an American dynastic household without threatening the primacy of the Vanderbilt name, who brought social credibility without financial competition, and who would, by the simple fact of marriage, resolve the question of what happened to Biltmore in the next generation. Cornelia was 22 when the relationship with Cecil moved from acquaintance to something more formal. Whether she felt, for him, what the social script called love, whether she experienced the marriage as a choice rather than a conclusion, is not something the surviving record settles clearly. What the record shows is that she did not resist it. She moved through the engagement with the same quality of contained cooperation that she had brought to most of what her life had required of her up to that point. The engagement was announced in the autumn of 1923. The press response was immediate and substantial. American newspapers covered the match with the mixture of enthusiasm and social calculation that characterized their coverage of Vanderbilt affairs. The family name still generated that response, even as the fortune behind it had narrowed. Cecil's British aristocratic credentials were noted with approval. The Biltmore estate was described in the coverage with the architectural reverence it reliably inspired in journalists who had never seen it and several who had. The wedding date was set for April 29, 1924. Edith managed the wedding arrangements with the thoroughness she brought to all significant estate events. 8,000 invitations were sent. The guest list represented a cross-section of American and British society that reflected Edith's decades of careful social cultivation. Old New York families, Washington political figures, European aristocrats, the residual network of Vanderbilt connections that still functioned as a social infrastructure, even as the financial base beneath it thinned. The Biltmore grounds were prepared with the kind of attention that required months of advance work. The gardens arranged, the house staffed to capacity, the logistics of feeding and accommodating that many guests worked out in the kind of detail that consumed entire weeks of planning. Cornelia wore a dress of ivory satin with a 15-foot train. The ceremony took place in All Souls Episcopal Church in Biltmore Village, the small town that George Vanderbilt had built adjacent to the estate for his workers, a fact that placed the wedding, though no one appears to have remarked on it at the time, inside a church that existed because of the same fortune that was now being transferred through this ceremony to the next generation. The photographs from the wedding show Cecil as composed and pleasant-looking, a man of 30 who had arrived at an advantageous outcome and knew it. Edith is present in several photographs with the satisfied expression of someone whose work has concluded successfully. Cornelia is there in all of them, dressed correctly, surrounded by flowers and family, and 8,000 people who had come to witness something that had been arranged, at its core, for reasons that had little to do with her specifically. She was 23 years old. The marriage transferred control of Biltmore's operations and finances into a structure that placed Cecil in a visible management role while the underlying ownership remained tied to the Vanderbilt estate. Cecil took on responsibility for the estate's agricultural operations and general administration, work that he approached with a competence that surprised some observers and that over the years following he would develop into a genuine expertise. He was not a passive or indifferent presence at Biltmore. He cared about the estate, engaged with it seriously, and over time became, in many practical respects, more attached to it than his wife. That divergence would take years to become fully visible. In the spring of 1924, it had not yet declared itself. The house was full of flowers, the photographs were being taken, and Cornelia Vanderbilt, now Cornelia Cecil, stood at the center of an event that had been designed around her, without ever quite being about her. George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil was born on February 27, 1925. He arrived 10 months after the wedding, which was noted with quiet satisfaction in the social circles that track such things. The succession had been secured. The Vanderbilt line, or something carrying its name, would continue. Edith, who had managed the estate through a decade of financial pressure and social uncertainty, following George Vanderbilt's death, now had a grandson. The Biltmore estate had, in the biological sense the dynastic logic required, a future. The birth was covered in the press with the enthusiasm that the Vanderbilt name still reliably generated. Brief notices in the New York papers, a longer piece in the Asheville Citizen that treated the event as local news of civic significance, which in a town whose economy was substantially shaped by the estate's operations, it arguably was. George Cecil was photographed in the way that wealthy infants were photographed in the 1920s, formally in white, positioned rather than held, the image composed to communicate prosperity and continuity, rather than anything as undignified as parental feeling. Cornelia was 24. The second son, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, arrived on August 7, 1928. Between the two births, the household at Biltmore had continued its established rhythms, the seasonal staffing cycles, the agricultural operations that Cecil was increasingly overseeing, the social visits that Edith still managed with her characteristic precision. Cornelia moved through these years with a quality of presence that the surviving accounts struggled to fix clearly. She was there. She participated in what the household required. She was, by external measures, fulfilling the role that the marriage and the estate had defined for her. But something in the accounts from people who knew her during this period carries a persistent undertone. A former staff member, interviewed decades later, remembered Cornelia during the years following George's birth as someone who seemed, in a word she used carefully, restless. Not unhappy in any dramatic or visible sense, not quarrelsome or cold. Restless, the quality of a person whose body is present in a place their attention has already left. The Biltmore nursery was managed with the same structural care that characterized every other department of the house. There were nurses, then governesses. The children's days were organized according to schedules that reflected both the practical demands of running a household of that scale and the pedagogical assumptions of the class. Structured time, appropriate activities, the early introduction of the behavioral codes that would be required of them as they grew. George and William were raised in the most literal sense by the institution of the house as much as by their parents. This was not unusual. In households of comparable scale and social position, the direct daily care of children was understood to be the work of paid staff, with parental involvement concentrated in specific, often formal interactions. Meals, outings, the kind of supervised contact that reinforced affection without dissolving the structural distinctions that organized the household. What the children experienced as family life was substantially mediated by employees, whose job it was to ensure that the children's needs were met and their behavior was correct. Whether Cornelia found this arrangement natural or alienating is not something she left a clear record of. What the record does show is that she began, in the years between William's birth in 1928 and the early 1930s, to spend increasing amounts of time away from Biltmore. Not dramatic absences, not yet. Trips to New York, visits to friends, periods in Europe that extended somewhat longer than social visits typically required. The absences were individually explainable. Together they formed a pattern that would take a few more years to become unmistakable. Cecil, meanwhile, was deepening his investment in the estate. He had come to Biltmore as a British aristocrat without independent wealth, inserted into the management of an American dynastic property through marriage. The real British will be relevant. And the position could easily have produced in him a kind of performative occupation, the appearance of engagement, without its substance. Instead, he developed genuine expertise. He studied the agricultural operations, worked with the estate's farmers and managers with a hands-on attention that the staff recognized and respected, and began thinking seriously about the long-term viability of a property that was consuming more than it generated. The financial pressure on Biltmore was not new, but it was intensifying. The 1920s had been nationally a decade of expansion and apparent prosperity, but the estate's economics operated on a different logic from the broader market. The cost of maintaining a 250-room house, its grounds, its staff, and its agricultural operations, was fixed at a scale that the estate's income streams, farming, timber, various small revenue sources, could not adequately address. Edith had managed this gap through a combination of land sales, careful expenditure, and the kind of financial discipline that required constant attention. Cecil was learning the same discipline. Cornelia's relationship to the estate's finances during this period was formal rather than active. She was its owner in the legal sense. The property was hers, held in her name as George Vanderbilt's sole heir. But the day-to-day management, the decisions about operations and expenditure and staff, had been Edith's domain and was becoming Cecil's. Cornelia occupied the center of the ownership structure while standing at the edge of its practical management. The boys were small. George was 3 when the Depression began. William barely 1. They would grow up in a house that was financially stressed, operationally demanding, and increasingly oriented around the question of its own survival rather than the comfort of its inhabitants. The Biltmore that George and William Cecil would inherit as their primary childhood environment was not the Biltmore of the photographs, the flawlessly staged wedding images, the guest season grandeur. It was a working estate under financial strain, managed by a father who took its obligations seriously, an increasingly absent mother who had begun, quietly and without announcement, the process of wanting something else. What that something else was, Cornelia had not yet made explicit. In 1928, with William newly born and the household arranged around her, she was still present, still photographed at the estate, still fulfilling, on the surface, the role that everything in her life had been organized to produce. The surface, by then, was doing considerable work. The first extended European trip Cornelia took after William's birth lasted 3 months. This was 1929, and transatlantic travel among the wealthy still carried the unhurried quality of an era before air travel compressed distance into inconvenience. Ocean liners, extended hotel stays, the slow movement between London and Paris and the Italian cities. This was how people of Cornelia's class experienced Europe, and a 3-month absence was not in isolation. Remarkable. Women of her background traveled. It was expected, even encouraged, as a sign of the cosmopolitan ease that distinguished serious social standing from merely local prominence. She came back. The household resumed. Cecil was managing the estate's autumn operations. The boys were in the nursery with their governesses. Edith was present, as she almost always was, overseeing the social and domestic machinery of Biltmore with the attention it required. But Cornelia went again the following year, and the year after that, and each time the trips grew somewhat longer, the return somewhat less energetic, the re-engagement with Biltmore's routines somewhat more visibly effortful. Europe offered Cornelia something that is worth being precise about, because it was not simply freedom in the abstract sense, the romantic notion of escape from constraint. What Europe offered specifically was anonymity, of a kind that Biltmore made structurally impossible. In Asheville, in the social world that radiated outward from the estate, Cornelia was always Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil. The name preceded her into every room, shaped every interaction, organized every relationship around a set of expectations and obligations that had nothing to do with who she actually was and everything to do with what she represented. The staff knew her as the mistress of the house. The town knew her as the Vanderbilt heir. The social world knew her as the woman whose wedding had filled 8,000 invitations. In London, in Paris, in the circles she began to cultivate during her increasingly extended visits, she could be present differently. Not unknown, the Vanderbilt name traveled, but the weight of it was differently distributed. She was not the center of a functioning dynastic institution in Europe. She was a wealthy American woman of good family, interesting perhaps, worth knowing, but not the fixed point around which an entire operation oriented itself. She began, during these years, to develop friendships and social connections that were genuinely her own. Not inherited from Edith's network, not relevant to Biltmore's operations, not filtered through the social arithmetic of appropriate matches and useful connections. The specific names and details of these European relationships from the late 1920s and early 1930s are only partially recoverable from the historical record, but the shape of what she was doing is clear enough. She was building a life adjacent to the one she had been assigned. Cecil was aware of the pattern. Whether he and Cornelia discussed it directly, whether there were explicit conversations about the marriage, about her increasing absences, about what was happening to the household they were nominally running together, is not clear from surviving correspondence. What is clear is that the marriage was becoming, by the early 1930s, a formal arrangement in the fullest sense, legally intact, publicly maintained, practically hollow. They shared the estate when Cornelia was there. They shared the children in the structured, mediated way that wealthy parents shared children. They shared a name and a social position. The emotional substance of the marriage, whatever it had been in 1924, had thinned to something that functioned more like a long-term contractual relationship than a partnership. Cecil managed Biltmore. Cornelia visited. George and William were 4 and 1 respectively when the Depression began in earnest in late 1929. The estate's financial situation, already difficult, moved into a register of genuine crisis. The agricultural operations that had been losing money quietly were now losing money loudly. The cost of maintaining the house, the staff, the heating, the repairs, The 1,000 ongoing expenses that a 250-room building required, pressed against an income that was shrinking in step with the broader economic collapse. Cecil began making decisions that reflected the severity of the situation. Staff reductions, operational consolidations, the prioritization of the estate's most productive activities over its more ornamental ones. Edith, now in her early 60s, remained at Biltmore through these years, with a consistency that contrasted sharply with Cornelia's increasing absences. She had spent decades managing the estate, first under George, then as his widow, then alongside Cornelia and Cecil. The house was, in a way that it had never quite been for Cornelia, her project. She had made decisions about it, fought for it financially, maintained its social relevance through years, when the money supporting it was quietly draining away. Her presence in the early 1930s had the quality of someone who is too much invested in a thing to consider the possibility of leaving it. Cornelia, by contrast, had never made that investment, or rather, the investment had been made on her behalf before she was old enough to consent to it, and she had grown up inside the result of someone else's consuming project without ever quite adopting it as her own. The house was hers in law. It had never become hers in the way it had been her father's, the way it was becoming Cecil's, the way it remained Edith's. In 1932, Cornelia spent 6 months in Europe. The boys were 7 and 4. Cecil was navigating the estate through the worst of the Depression's financial pressure. Edith was there, as always, steady and managerial and present. The 6-month absence was long enough that it stopped being individually explainable. The social world that tracked these things began to notice. The Asheville papers, which had always covered Biltmore's affairs with the proprietary interest of a community that understood its own fortunes as connected to the estates, ran occasional items noting Mrs. Cecil's extended stay abroad. The tone of these pieces was careful, nothing accusatory, nothing speculative, the restraint of a local press that understood the economic weight the Vanderbilt name carried in western North Carolina and had no interest in damaging what it depended on. But the absences were accumulating into a record, and in a social world where presence was itself a form of communication, Cornelia's increasing distance from Biltmore was saying something that no one had yet found a direct way to address. In the autumn of 1930, John Cecil made a decision that would alter the character of Biltmore permanently. He opened the estate to paying visitors. The admission price was modest, 25 cents per person, and the access was limited to the gardens rather than the house itself. The framing, in the local press and in the careful language Cecil used when discussing it publicly, was that of a generous gesture toward a community under economic strain. Asheville had been hit hard. Western North Carolina had been hit hard. The Depression had arrived in rural and small city America before the 1929 crash formalized it nationally. And by 1930, the region around Biltmore was operating in conditions of genuine hardship, unemployment, failing farms, the particular desperation of a mountain economy with limited industrial base and diminishing agricultural returns. The estate's gardens were extraordinary. Olmsted's design, maintained over decades by a staff of skilled horticulturalists, represented one of the finest examples of formal and informal landscape design in the country. Opening them to the public at 25 cents was, on its face, an act of civic generosity. It was also, less visibly, an act of financial survival. The estate's income problem had been structural since George Vanderbilt built it, and the Depression had removed the cushion that had previously allowed the gap between income and expenditure to be managed rather than solved. The agricultural operations, the dairy, the poultry, the tenant farming, were producing less revenue as commodity prices collapsed. The timber operations, carefully managed under the forestry program George had established, provided some income, but not enough. The staff had been reduced, but the building itself could not be reduced. It existed at a scale that generated fixed costs regardless of how many people were living in it or how carefully those people watched their expenditures. 25 cents per visitor did not solve the problem, but it established a principle that would prove consequential. That Biltmore's value to the outside world was not purely private, not purely the property of the family that owned it, but was in some sense public, accessible, available to be converted into revenue by the simple act of opening a gate. The tenant farmers who worked the land surrounding the estate were, in 1930 and 1931, operating in conditions that the 25-cent admission price did not address. These were families who had been working Biltmore's agricultural land under arrangements that predated the Depression. Tenant and sharecropping structures common to the region, in which the farmer worked the land in exchange for a share of the crop and housing provided by the estate. When commodity prices fell, the share of the crop worth less meant the farmer had less. The estate's costs did not fall proportionally. The gap between what the arrangement cost the farmers and what it returned to them widened in the Depression years in ways that no one at the management level of Biltmore appears to have addressed with any systematic urgency. Cecil was not indifferent to the situation. By the accounts available, he was a conscientious manager who took the welfare of the estate's workers and tenants more seriously than the minimal legal obligations of the landlord-tenant relationship required. He made decisions during the Depression years that reflected genuine concern, maintaining employment at the estate longer than pure financial calculation would have dictated, finding work for people who might otherwise have had none, managing the reduction of operations in ways that distributed the impact as widely as possible. But conscientious management within an unjust structure is still management within an unjust structure. The tenant farming arrangements that underpinned Biltmore's agricultural operations were not of Cecil's invention, but they were his to maintain or challenge, and he maintained them. The estate survived the Depression in part because the people working its land absorbed a significant portion of the economic shock in ways that did not appear in the estate's formal accounting. Cornelia was in Europe for much of this period. This is not a simple moral equation. She did not design the tenant farming arrangements, and her presence at Biltmore would not necessarily have changed how Cecil managed them. But the distance is worth noting for what it meant to the people whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in her name. The woman whose name was on the ownership documents, whose inheritance structured the entire operation, was spending the worst years of the Depression on another continent, in a social world, where the crisis was experienced primarily as a diminishment of comfort rather than a threat to survival. Back at Biltmore, Edith was watching the situation with the practical focus of someone who had been managing the estate's difficulties for nearly 2 decades. She had overseen the land sale to the federal government in 1914. She had navigated the financial pressures of the late teens and 20s. She understood the estate's economics with the intimacy of long involvement, and she understood by the early 1930s that the situation had moved beyond what careful management alone could address. It was Edith, not Cornelia, who was the primary voice in the conversations about Biltmore's future during these years. Cecil was the operational manager, but Edith retained a moral authority over the estate's direction that came from her decades of investment in its survival. When the decision was made to expand public access from the gardens to the house itself, a step that would eventually be taken in 1930 for the gardens, and considered more seriously for the interior as the decade progressed. The conversation happened between Cecil and Edith. Cornelia's involvement in these discussions, from her position in Europe, was at most epistolary. The estate's workers and tenants, watching the garden visitors arrive on weekends with their 25-cent tickets, watching the careful maintenance of the mansion's exterior while their own situations remained unchanged, occupied a position that the estate's official history has not examined closely. They were the economic foundation of an operation whose public face was architectural grandeur, and the Depression had made the terms of that foundation more visible without making them more equitable. By 1933, the gardens were drawing enough visitors to suggest that the model had commercial potential beyond what anyone had initially projected. Cecil began thinking more seriously about what that potential might mean for the estate's long-term viability. Cornelia that year was in England. There is a letter dated the spring of 1932 from Edith Vanderbilt to a close friend in Washington, whose name appears frequently in Edith's surviving correspondence. The letter covers several topics in the careful, socially modulated language that characterized Edith's written communication: estate matters, mutual acquaintances, the general difficulty of the times. Near the end, almost as an aside, Edith writes that Cornelia's continued absence is becoming difficult to explain to certain people, and that she hopes the situation will resolve itself before it requires more direct attention. The phrasing is Edith's oblique, controlled, the problem named only enough to acknowledge it without the indignity of describing it plainly. But the letter is one of the clearest surviving indications that by 1932, the state of Cornelia's marriage was no longer a private matter contained within the household. It was becoming, in Edith's carefully managed social world, a topic. John Cecil had, by this point, been running Biltmore's operations largely alone for several years. Not alone in the staffing sense. The estate still employed considerable numbers of people, and Cecil worked alongside a management structure that included farm supervisors, household staff, and various specialists. But alone in the sense that mattered socially. There was no mistress of the house in any functional sense. Edith filled parts of that role out of habit and investment, but Edith was in her early 60s, and the role properly belonged to Cornelia. Cecil's response to this situation was, by all available evidence, to work. He threw himself into the estate's operations with an absorption that served the practical function of filling the space Cornelia's absence created. By the early 1930s, he was deeply knowledgeable about Biltmore's agricultural operations, its forestry management, its financial structure. He had developed relationships with the estate's workers and tenants that were based on direct engagement rather than the mediated contact of an absentee owner. He knew the farm managers by name, knew their concerns, understood the operational details of a working estate in a way that would have surprised the people who had watched him arrive as a British second son 10 years earlier, with no obvious qualification beyond his bloodline. This investment had a cost. Cecil's attachment to Biltmore deepened in direct proportion to Cornelia's withdrawal from it. The estate was becoming for him not simply a management responsibility, but something closer to an identity. The work gave him a purpose and a position that his original social situation, younger son of a minor aristocratic family, without independent fortune, dependent on the accident of a fortunate marriage, could not have provided on its own. Biltmore made Cecil into something, and what it was making him into was increasingly incompatible with a wife who wanted to be somewhere else. George was 7 in 1932. William was 4. The boys were being raised in the house primarily by their governesses, with Cecil present and engaged in the way that the era's conventions for fathers of his class permitted, involved in decisions about their education and welfare, visible at meals and during organized family time, but not the primary daily presence in their lives. They were Biltmore children in the most complete sense, formed by the estate's physical environment, its rhythms, its particular social world of staff and tenants, and occasional visitors. With a father who was committed to the place and a mother who was, with increasing frequency, somewhere else. The effect on the boys of their mother's absences is not something the historical record addresses with any directness from this period. They were too young to leave written accounts, and the adults around them, Cecil, Edith, the staff, had every reason to manage the situation with discretion rather than acknowledge it in any form that might be preserved. What can be observed is the structure of their childhood, a stable, managed, well-resourced environment with a highly present institutional framework, and a mother who visited. Cornelia returned to Biltmore in the autumn of 1932 after her extended European stay. The return was noted in the Asheville papers with the slightly excessive warmth of a local press compensating for the awkwardness of having noted the absence. She was photographed at the estate, photographed with Cecil, photographed in the context of Biltmore's ongoing operations. The surface was carefully maintained. What happened between Cornelia and Cecil during this period at the estate is not directly documented, but the proximity of events suggests that the autumn of 1932 involved conversations about the marriage that had not been possible while Cornelia was in Europe, that her return forced an encounter with the situation that the Atlantic had been holding at a comfortable distance. The formal separation proceedings that would come in 1934 did not emerge from nowhere. They were the conclusion of a process that had been developing for years, and the autumn of 1932, when the two people at the center of that process were finally in the same place at the same time, was likely when that process moved from accumulation to decision. Edith's role during this period was complicated by her dual investment in the estate on one hand and in her daughter on the other, with the two interests pulling in different directions. Cornelia leaving Biltmore permanently would resolve the personal situation at the cost of the institutional one. Cornelia staying would stabilize the estate while leaving unresolved whatever had driven her away. Edith, who had spent decades making the practical choice over the personal one, understood the calculation clearly. Whether she pressed Cornelia in either direction, or whether she held the conflict at the oblique, letter-writing distance she had always preferred, is not something the surviving record clarifies. What the record does show is that by the end of 1932, after Cornelia's return and the weeks that followed, she was gone again. Back to Europe, with no announced return date, the absence this time carrying a quality different from the previous ones. The previous absences had been long. This one felt to the people at Biltmore who were paying attention like something other than a trip. The boys remained at the estate with their father and grandmother. The house continued its operations. Cecil managed the farms, the staff, the finances, the ongoing project of keeping the largest private residence in America functional in the middle of an economic depression. Cornelia sent letters. They came from London, from Paris, from addresses that changed with a frequency, suggesting she was not, in any settled sense, living somewhere. She was moving. She was constructing, slowly and without announcement, something that did not yet have a name. The legal separation between Cornelia and John Cecil was finalized in 1934. The proceedings were handled with the discretion that both families required. No public courtroom drama, no scandalous depositions, no details offered to the press beyond what the minimal formalities of announcement demanded. The Asheville Citizen covered it briefly. The New York papers gave it a paragraph or two. For a family whose wedding had generated breathless coverage across the eastern seaboard a decade earlier, the dissolution of the marriage was managed with a quietness that itself communicated something. That the people involved had resources, social and legal, to ensure that the ending was as controlled as the beginning had been staged. Cornelia did not contest the arrangements. This is worth noting because the arrangements were not straightforwardly in her favor. Cecil retained his position at Biltmore. His management role, his residence on the estate, his operational authority over the property that Cornelia technically owned. The boys, George and William, remained at Biltmore with their father. Cornelia, the legal owner of the estate, the Vanderbilt heir for whom the entire dynastic structure had been constructed and maintained, left. The house stayed. The husband stayed. The children stayed. She crossed the Atlantic and did not come back in any sustained sense for the rest of her life. The decision to leave the children at Biltmore rather than take them with her, or to contest for custody in any aggressive way, is one of the most consequential and least explained choices in Cornelia's story. The historical record does not provide a clear account of how this outcome was reached. There were no public custody proceedings. There was no documented negotiation whose terms survive. What remains is the result. Two boys, 9 and 6 years old in 1934, growing up at Biltmore with their father while their mother was in Europe. The social interpretation of this arrangement in 1934 was not kind to Cornelia. The era's conventions about motherhood, particularly for women of her class, for whom the performance of maternal devotion was both expected and publicly monitored, made her departure a thing that required explanation, and received instead silence. The silence was itself interpreted by the social world that watched these things as confirmation of something that reflected poorly on her. A mother who left her children was, in the taxonomy of female failure available in 1930s American society, a particular kind of failure. The wealth that surrounded the situation did not soften the judgment. If anything, it sharpened it. She had every resource, every advantage, every possible support for any conceivable version of maternal engagement, and she had still gone. What the judgment missed, or chose not to examine, was the structure that had produced the situation. Cornelia had been inserted into Biltmore at birth, shaped for a role she had not chosen, married at 23 to a man selected through a process in which her preferences were a secondary consideration, and installed in a household whose rhythms and demands and institutional weight had been organized around the estate's survival rather than her own. The leaving was not simply a choice made freely by a woman with options. It was the eventual result of a life built entirely around other people's requirements, in which the self that might have had preferences of its own had never been given adequate room to develop. But consequences do not wait for context. George and William were 9 and 6, and their mother was gone. In England, Cornelia began the construction of a life that the historical record captures only partially. She settled initially in London, moving in the social circles that transatlantic wealth and an old American name made accessible. She was 33 in 1934, young enough that the life she was building could reasonably be understood as a beginning rather than a retreat. She formed friendships that were genuinely her own, developed interests that had not been shaped by Edith's management or Biltmore's requirements, moved through a social world in which she was a participant rather than an institution. She also, during the mid-1930s, formed a relationship with a man named Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson. The relationship developed over several years and would eventually result in a second marriage in 1948. Bulkley Johnson was a British subject, a man whose social position was comfortable without being grand, whose life did not revolve around the management of an inherited American dynastic estate. He was, in the most basic sense, someone Cornelia had found herself rather than been given. The contrast with the Cecil marriage was complete enough to be its own commentary. Back at Biltmore, the estate was changing. Cecil had moved forward with the commercial development that the Depression had made necessary. The garden visits that had begun in 1930 were generating enough interest to suggest that the model had a future, and Cecil was thinking carefully about what that future looked like. The house itself, the 250 rooms of it, was an asset that was costing money to maintain. The question of whether it could be made to generate revenue, and how, and for whom, and at what cost to its character, was one that Cecil was beginning to engage with seriously. Edith was still at Biltmore. She was in her late 60s by the mid-1930s, and the estate had been the center of her life for nearly 4 decades. She and Cecil had developed, through the years of Cornelia's absence and the practical demands of running the estate together, a working relationship that had the closeness of people who have shared a long, difficult project. Edith's feelings about Cornelia's departure, about the grandchildren she was now primarily responsible for, about the daughter who had left the house that Edith had spent her adult life preserving, do not survive in any document that addresses them directly. What survives is her continued presence. She was there. She managed what needed managing. She maintained the social obligations that the estate's position required. She was, in the years following Cornelia's departure, more the mistress of Biltmore than Cornelia had ever quite been. Not by design, but by default, the role settling onto her through the simple fact of her remaining. Cornelia, meanwhile, was building a life in a country where the name Vanderbilt was history rather than obligation, where no one needed her to be anything in particular, where the 250 rooms she legally owned were far enough away that they could almost, on certain days, be forgotten entirely. The formal divorce between Cornelia and John Cecil was completed in 1934, though the legal and financial arrangements that structured its aftermath took considerably longer to settle into their final form. The separation had been announced. The marriage was over in any practical sense. But the question of what happened to Biltmore, who controlled it, who profited from it, who bore responsibility for its survival, was not resolved by the simple fact of a legal dissolution. It was resolved, gradually and without much fanfare, by the choices Cornelia made about what she was willing to fight for and what she was willing to leave behind. She left behind almost everything. This is the aspect of the divorce that the historical record tends to pass over quickly, partly because the details are legally complex, and partly because the outcome is difficult to explain in terms that make Cornelia's decisions look entirely coherent. She was the legal owner of the Biltmore estate. The property was hers, inherited from her father, held in her name, the material foundation of the Vanderbilt legacy in its most visible American form. Cecil had no independent claim to the estate beyond his marriage to its owner. When that marriage ended, the straightforward legal logic suggested that control would revert entirely to Cornelia. It did not work that way. Cecil remained at Biltmore. He remained in his management role. He continued overseeing the agricultural operations, the staff, the commercial development he had been building through the early 1930s. The arrangements that allowed this were technically Cornelia's to revoke. She could have at any point exercised her ownership rights in ways that would have required Cecil to leave. She did not. Whether this reflected legal advice she was given, financial calculations about the estate's viability without Cecil's management, emotional exhaustion with the entire situation, or some combination of all three is not something the surviving record establishes clearly. What it established in practice was a situation of considerable peculiarity. An estate owned by a woman who lived in Europe, managed by her former husband, housing the children she had left behind, maintained by a staff whose livelihoods depended on arrangements whose legal foundations were, at minimum, unusual. Cecil was, in effect, running a property he did not own for reasons that were partly financial, partly personal, and partly rooted in the fact that no one else was doing it. The financial dimensions of the divorce settlement are not fully documented in the public record. What is known is that Cornelia received income from the estate, that some mechanism existed by which the property's revenue, such as it was during the Depression, flowed in part to its owner in Europe. The amounts involved were not large relative to the estate's costs. Biltmore was not generating significant profits in the mid-1930s. It was generating enough to justify its continued operation and not enough to do so comfortably. Cecil's position was in some ways more constrained than it appeared. He had invested years of work and considerable personal commitment into an estate he did not own and could not inherit. His sons would inherit it, or would inherit the question of what to do with it, but Cecil himself had no claim that would survive Cornelia's decisions about the property's future. He was managing on tolerance, and he understood this. It gave his stewardship of Biltmore a particular quality, the focused, slightly anxious investment of someone who knows that what they are building can be taken from them at any point, and who responds to that knowledge by building more carefully rather than less. Edith died in 1958, decades after the divorce, having spent the intervening years at Biltmore with a consistency that outlasted everyone's expectations, including perhaps her own. But in the mid-1930s, she was still present, still functional, still the most continuous human thread connecting the estate's past to its uncertain present. Her relationship with Cecil during the post-divorce years had the quality of a partnership formed by necessity and sustained by mutual respect. Two people who had both, for different reasons, stayed when the person who was supposed to be there had left. The boys grew through their childhood and adolescence at Biltmore during the years following the divorce. George, the elder, was 9 in 1934. He would be educated in England at some point. The details of his schooling reflect the complicated transatlantic identity that his parents' situation had produced before returning to America. William followed a similar trajectory. Both boys grew up shaped by the estate in ways that would prove, in their adult lives, both formative and burdensome. Their contact with Cornelia during their childhood years was limited to her occasional visits and their occasional trips to England. The relationship between Cornelia and her sons during this period was not, by any account, one of comfortable closeness. It had the texture of contact between people who share a fundamental connection and a fundamental distance simultaneously. The visits meaningful enough to matter and infrequent enough to carry the slight awkwardness of encounters between people who do not fully know each other. Cornelia's visits to Biltmore after the divorce were rare and, when they occurred, reported in the local press with a slightly over-eager warmth that reflected the community's continued investment in the Vanderbilt connection. She was the owner. She was, in the formal sense, the reason the estate existed in its current form. Her presence was newsworthy. Her absences were the normal condition. In London, through the late 1930s, she continued building the life she had chosen. The relationship with Bulkley Johnson developed. She moved in social circles that had no direct connection to Biltmore's operations or the Vanderbilt legacy's ongoing management. She was present in a city and a social world that would, within a few years, be transformed by a war that altered everything, including the already fragile economics of large inherited estates on both sides of the Atlantic. What Cornelia had effectively done, through the combination of her departure, her non-contestation of Cecil's management role, and her continued legal ownership without operational involvement, was create a situation that had no obvious resolution. The estate existed in a kind of suspended condition, owned by someone who was absent, managed by someone who had no permanent claim, inhabited by children who would eventually have to decide what to do with something they had not asked to inherit. The conditions of the divorce had not resolved Biltmore's future. They had deferred it. George Henry Vanderbilt. Cecil grew up knowing that the house he lived in was famous. This is not a common condition of childhood, and its effects are difficult to separate from the other unusual conditions of his early life. The absent mother, the Depression-era financial strain, the particular social world were out of an estate that employed more people than most of the surrounding community. But the fame of the house was its own distinct pressure, operating independently of the family's other complications. Visitors came to look at it. Newspapers wrote about it. The name Biltmore carried a weight in the regional and national imagination that had nothing to do with what it was like to be a child growing up inside it. What it was like, concretely, was large and managed and not entirely private. The gardens had been open to paying visitors since 1930. The presence of strangers on the grounds, controlled, ticketed, limited to certain areas but present, was part of the texture of George's childhood in a way that no ordinary child's home environment included. He grew up in a place that was simultaneously his home and increasingly a public attraction. The distinction between the private family spaces and the areas accessible to visitors was maintained carefully, but the knowledge that such a distinction was necessary was itself formative. The awareness from an early age that the house you lived in was something other people paid to see. Cecil managed the boys' upbringing with the focused competence he brought to everything at Biltmore. He was present, more present than fathers of his class and era were typically expected to be, engaged with his son's education and development in ways that reflected both genuine affection and the particular intensity of a man for whom the estate and its future had become a consuming preoccupation. The boys were Biltmore's future in the most direct sense. They would inherit whatever Cecil managed to preserve. His investment in them was inseparable from his investment in the estate. Their education followed the transatlantic pattern that their family's complicated identity suggested. George was sent to school in England, to Eton following his father's educational lineage, in the late 1930s. The timing placed his departure from Biltmore just as Europe was moving toward a war that would make transatlantic travel and communication difficult and eventually dangerous. William followed a similar path. The schooling was appropriate to their class, their father's background, and the social expectations attached to the Vanderbilt name. It was also practically a removal from the estate that had shaped them, a departure into a world their mother inhabited but had never quite introduced them to, in a country their father came from but had left behind. Cornelia was in England during these years. Her sons were eventually in England. The proximity did not produce the closeness that geography might have suggested. The visits happened. Cornelia saw her sons when they were in the country, maintained contact, was not entirely absent from their English school years, in the way she had been absent from their American childhood. But the relationship had been shaped by the years of distance. And relationships shaped that way do not recover their natural form simply because the distance has been reduced. The boys knew their mother as someone who was sometimes present rather than someone who was reliably there. And the emotional template established in childhood tends to persist regardless of subsequent geography. William Cecil, the younger son, would later describe his childhood in terms that were careful but not warm. The language of a person discussing formative experiences that were complex enough to require considerable management before they could be discussed at all. He spoke of Biltmore with a mix of pride and burden that suggested the estate had been as much weight as gift. That growing up as its heir had involved obligations and expectations that arrived before he was equipped to evaluate whether he wanted them. George the elder carried the additional weight of primogeniture without its traditional supports. In the British aristocratic system his father came from, the eldest son inherited the title and the estate, and the entire social and legal framework was organized to make that inheritance comprehensible and manageable. In the American context, there was no title, no comparable legal framework, and an estate whose economics had been problematic since before George was born. He was heir to something that had been maintained at considerable cost by his father's labor and his grandmother's endurance, and the question of what he was supposed to do with it was one that he would spend a significant portion of his adult life attempting to answer. Edith Vanderbilt remained at the estate through the boys' childhoods and beyond. Her relationship with her grandsons had the quality of a connection formed under unusual circumstances and sustained by proximity and mutual need. She was the most consistent female presence in their lives during the years when their mother was in Europe, and whatever the limitations of that role, it was a role she filled with the reliability that had characterized everything she did at Biltmore. She managed, she was present, she endured. The Second World War altered the estate's situation in ways that both accelerated and complicated the changes already underway. The house was used during the war years to store artworks evacuated from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, paintings considered too valuable and too vulnerable to remain in the capital during wartime. The decision to use Biltmore as a storage facility for national artistic treasures was a practical one based on the estate's remoteness and its climate-controlled spaces. It was also, inadvertently, a kind of commentary. The grandest private house in America repurposed as a warehouse for public cultural assets during a national emergency. The private yielding to the public in a way that gestured toward what the estate would eventually become permanently. Cecil navigated the war years with the same steady management he brought to everything. The estate's operations continued. The staff, reduced from the pre-Depression years but still substantial, maintained the property. The boys were in England, then moving through the complicated channels of wartime education and eventual military service. Cornelia was in England, enduring the war and the social world she had built there. Her American estate a distant legal fact rather than a daily reality. By the war's end in 1945, George Cecil was 20 years old, and William was 17. They were young men who had grown up across two countries, shaped by a house they had largely left and a family structure that had been fractured before they were old enough to understand what an intact one looked like. Cornelia married Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson in 1948. She was 47 years old. The marriage took place quietly. No 8,000 invitations, no correspondent coverage, no Olmsted-designed gardens arranged for the occasion. A small ceremony, the appropriate witnesses, the legal formality completed without the apparatus of dynastic performance that had surrounded the first marriage a quarter-century earlier. The contrast was complete enough to suggest intention. That the simplicity was itself a kind of statement about what this marriage was not. Bulkley Johnson was a British subject of comfortable but not exceptional social standing. He had served during the war, had a life and a social world of his own that predated Cornelia, and did not depend on her name or her estate for its coherence. He was not, in any of the ways that had mattered to Edith when arranging the Cecil match, an advantageous marriage. He brought no title, no particular social elevation, no financial resolution to any of Biltmore's ongoing problems. What he appears to have offered, in the careful reading of the available record, was something considerably simpler and considerably harder to arrange, a relationship that Cornelia had chosen freely, with a person whose presence in her life was not the product of someone else's calculation. The marriage lasted until Bulkley Johnson's death. Cornelia did not remarry again. The life she built in England during the post-war years had a texture quite different from the Biltmore existence she had left. She and Bulkley Johnson lived in London and later in the English countryside, in houses that were comfortable and appropriately scaled to two people living a private life, rather than monuments requiring armies of staff and generating their own institutional gravity. She moved in social circles that valued her as a person rather than as a name, or at least in which the name carried different weight. Historical interest rather than ongoing obligation. She developed during these decades a genuine engagement with painting. The specifics of her artistic practice, how seriously she pursued it, what she produced, how it was received by people who encountered it, are not extensively documented, but the pursuit itself is consistent with someone finding, in middle and later life, an activity that was entirely her own. Painting required no staff, no estate management, no navigation of dynastic obligation. It was something she could do alone, in a room of her own choosing, without the result being relevant to anyone but herself. This private quality, the deliberate cultivation of a life whose dimensions were personal rather than institutional, defined Cornelia's English decades in ways that made them difficult to write about, because the historical record is most generous to people whose actions have public consequences. Cornelia's actions, after her departure from Biltmore, were largely private. She did not give interviews. She did not publish memoirs. She did not engage with the growing public interest in Biltmore. The visitors, the developing commercial enterprise, the Vanderbilt heritage industry that was gradually constructing a narrative around the estate, from which she was conspicuously absent. Her absence from the Biltmore narrative was not accidental. The estate's public story, as it developed through the post-war decades under Cecil's management, was organized around certain fixed elements: the architectural grandeur, the Vanderbilt heritage, George Vanderbilt's vision, Edith's stewardship, and Cecil's practical genius for keeping the thing alive. Cornelia appeared in this narrative primarily as George Vanderbilt's daughter and the estate's legal heir, the conduit through which ownership had passed from one generation to the next. Her own story, the decades she had spent in Europe, the marriage she had left, and the life she had built in its place, was not part of the account that Biltmore's developing public identity required. The erasure was mutual. Cornelia did not contest the narrative. She did not seek to correct the record or insert herself into the estate's public story. She had left, and leaving in the complete way she had chosen to do it meant accepting that the place would go on without her, and would tell its story without her in it. What this meant for her relationship with her sons was a complication that the available record addresses only obliquely. George and William were building their own relationships with Biltmore during the post-war years. George, in particular, was becoming involved in the estate's management, following his father's path with a seriousness that suggested he had accepted, or was in the process of accepting, the inheritance that Biltmore represented. The estate was becoming their project in a way it had never become their mother's, and their investment in it created a distance from Cornelia that was different from the simple geographic distance of her European residence. She had left Biltmore. They were returning to it. The divergence was not only geographic. Edith died in August 1958. She was 91 years old and had lived at Biltmore for 60 years, having arrived as George Vanderbilt's new wife in 1898 and remained through everything that followed: his death, the financial pressures, the Depression, the war, Cornelia's departure, Cecil's management, the gradual transformation of the estate from private residence to something more complicated. Her death removed the last person who had known Biltmore as George Vanderbilt had built it, who carried in living memory the estate's original intention and the person who had created it. Cornelia was in England when her mother died. She was 57 years old. Whether she returned for the funeral, whether she and Edith had maintained the kind of contact in the final years that might have allowed for anything resembling resolution between them, the record does not clarify. What is clear is that by 1958, the Biltmore that Edith had spent her life preserving was well on its way to becoming something neither of them had anticipated, and Cornelia had played no part in shaping. Cecil had opened the house itself to paying visitors in 1930, the gardens first, the interior eventually, and the commercial model had been developing steadily. By the late 1950s, Biltmore was receiving tens of thousands of visitors annually. It was becoming, in the American tourism landscape, a destination. The estate that George Vanderbilt had built as a private retreat, that Edith had preserved through decades of financial difficulty, that Cornelia had inherited and left, was turning into a business. Cornelia owned it still. The legal fact of her ownership persisted unchanged, a thread of formal connection to a place she had not lived in for more than 2 decades. She received income from it, presumably. She received correspondence about it, certainly. Whether she received any of this with something resembling emotional engagement, or whether Biltmore had become, by the late 1950s, simply an administrative fact of her life, rather than anything she experienced as meaningful, this is a question the record does not answer. The decision to open Biltmore's interior to paying visitors was not made in a single moment. It accumulated, the way most consequential decisions do, through a series of smaller choices that each seemed individually reasonable and that together produced an outcome that would have been unthinkable to the man who built the house. George Vanderbilt had constructed Biltmore as an act of private vision, a withdrawal from the commercial energy of his family's origins into something cultivated, personal, and deliberately removed from the public gaze. The house was not designed to be looked at by strangers. It was designed to be lived in by one man and his carefully selected guests. The distinction mattered to him. It had been, in a real sense, the point. By the time Cecil finished what he had started in 1930, the house was receiving paying visitors through its front door. The garden openings of 1930 had demonstrated something Cecil had suspected but needed evidence to act on, that the public appetite for Biltmore was substantial and consistent. People came. They paid their 25 cents. They walked Olmsted's paths. They looked at the house from the grounds with the slightly reverent attention of people encountering something they had read about. They came back. They brought other people. The numbers grew steadily through the 1930s despite the Depression, or perhaps partly because of it. In an era of economic contraction, a 25-cent admission to something magnificent was a transaction that offered considerable value. Cecil expanded the model carefully. The house itself presented a different set of challenges from the gardens. The logistics of moving large numbers of people through rooms filled with irreplaceable objects, the staffing required to manage visitor flow and prevent damage, the interpretive infrastructure needed to make the rooms meaningful to people encountering them without context. These were not trivial problems, and Cecil approached them with the methodical attention he brought to all aspects of the estate's operation. The interior opened to visitors in stages through the late 1930s and into the post-war period, with access expanding as the operational capacity to manage it developed. By the 1950s, Biltmore was conducting guided tours through a significant portion of the house. The main rooms, the banquet hall, the winter garden, the library that George Vanderbilt had assembled with scholarly seriousness and that now served as a set piece for tourists who moved through it in organized groups, pausing at the velvet ropes. The velvet ropes are worth dwelling on for a moment. They appeared in the rooms of Biltmore as a practical necessity, a way of managing visitor movement and protecting furnishings that were both fragile and valuable. They transformed the rooms in a specific way, from spaces designed for use into spaces designed for viewing. The library, the banquet hall, the bedrooms, each had been built and furnished for the experience of inhabiting them, for the particular sensation of being inside them as a person who lived there. The ropes converted that experience into something else entirely. The rooms became images of themselves. They became exhibits. George Vanderbilt's books were still on the shelves. His art was still on the walls. The tapestries he had imported from Europe still hung in the rooms where he had placed them. But the relationship between the objects and the people in the rooms had been fundamentally altered. The objects were now being presented to people who would never touch them, who moved past them in groups, whose connection to the rooms was visual and temporary, and mediated by a guide reciting information about what they were looking at. This transformation, from private residence to public attraction, had a financial logic that was impossible to argue with by the 1950s. The visitor revenue was the primary mechanism by which the estate sustained itself. Without it, the maintenance costs of a 250-room house could not be covered. The alternative to opening the house was not preserving it as a private home. The alternative was watching it deteriorate, or selling it, or demolishing it. Cecil understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent decades working through the estate's economics, and he made the choice that kept the building standing. Cornelia owned the building that was being turned into a tourist attraction. Her name appeared in the estate's official materials as George Vanderbilt's daughter, and the ownership link between his original vision and the current operation. She received the financial distributions that the estate generated. She was, in the formal accounting, a beneficiary of the transformation Cecil was managing. Whether she was consulted about the specific decisions, the expansion of visitor access, the interpretive approach, the commercial development of the Biltmore brand, is not clearly documented. The practical management was Cecil's and had been for 2 decades. The decisions about how to develop the commercial model were his to make. Cornelia's distance from the operation was by this point so established that consultation would have required a kind of re-engagement with the estate's management that she had made clear through years of absence she was not prepared for. The visitors who came to Biltmore in the 1950s encountered a narrative about the Vanderbilt family that emphasized George and Edith, the builder and the preserver, the 2 figures whose investment in the estate was most legible as devotion. Cornelia appeared in this narrative in her reduced role, the heir, the conduit, the legal link. Her story, the decades in Europe, the failed marriage, the departure, was not part of what the tours offered. It was not the story the estate needed to tell about itself. The tourists moved through the rooms in their groups, looked at the tapestries and the portraits, and the library and the banquet hall set for a dinner that would never happen, and heard about George Vanderbilt's vision and Edith Vanderbilt's stewardship. They heard about the construction, the craftsmen, the architectural details, the historical context. They did not hear about the woman who had inherited all of it and gone. Outside the velvet ropes, in the rooms that visitors did not enter, in the private quarters that Cecil and his staff maintained as functional living and working spaces, the estate continued its actual daily operation. The farm management, the maintenance schedules, the staff coordination, the financial management of an enterprise that was generating revenue, but not, in most years, generating it easily. The house that tourists saw as a completed monument was behind the ropes, a working institution with all the ongoing demands that institutions carry. Cecil managed both versions of Biltmore simultaneously, the monument and the institution, with a skill that few people were positioned to fully appreciate, because appreciating it required understanding both what the house was publicly and what it cost privately. Cornelia understood neither version anymore, or at least understood them only abstractly, from a distance measured in thousands of miles and decades of deliberate separation. By the mid-1950s, the American press had largely stopped writing about Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil. This was not the result of a single decision or a deliberate campaign of erasure. It was the natural outcome of sustained absence. The social and journalistic world loses interest in people who give it nothing to work with, and Cornelia had been giving it nothing for 20 years. She did not grant interviews. She did not attend the events that generated coverage. She did not make statements about Biltmore, about the Vanderbilt legacy, about the developments at the estate that were regularly generating local and occasionally national press interest. She was, from the perspective of anyone trying to write about her, simply unavailable. The Vanderbilt name itself was undergoing a broader cultural shift during these decades. The generation of Vanderbilts who had defined the family's public identity, the ones who had built the Newport cottages, staged the famous balls, participated in the transatlantic aristocracy exchange that had made the name synonymous with a particular kind of American excess, were dying or had died. Their houses were being demolished or converted or opened to tourists. The social world that had given the name its particular charge was dissolving into history, replaced by a different set of wealthy families operating in a different post-war economy with different values and different ways of displaying them. Cornelia had no children carrying the Vanderbilt name. Her sons were Cecil's. Her own name, through her second marriage, was Bulkley Johnson in the social context where she used it. The Vanderbilt identity that had structured every aspect of her childhood and young adulthood was, in her daily life in England, largely absent, present only in the legal documents that connected her to the estate she owned, and in the occasional moments when an American visitor to her social world made the connection and registered the slight surprise of encountering, in a London drawing room, the Vanderbilt heir. The surprise by the 1960s was less charged than it would have been a generation earlier. The Vanderbilt name carried historical resonance, but not current social electricity. It was a name from a story that had already been told, whose ending was known, whose principal actors were gone. Cornelia was its surviving representative in the direct female line, and she was living in England in a house that was not a monument, attending to a life that generated no coverage and sought none. Her sons, by contrast, were becoming increasingly identified with Biltmore's public story. George Cecil had become involved in the estate's management by the late 1950s, following the path his father had established. William Cecil would eventually take a primary management role that would prove consequential for the estate's development. Both men were building their adult identities in significant part around their relationship to Biltmore, attending to it, developing it, making decisions about its future that would shape what it became. Their investment in the estate had the quality of people who had been raised by it and had accepted the terms of that upbringing. The divergence between Cornelia and her sons, the mother who had left and the sons who had stayed, was by the 1960s a settled fact rather than an ongoing drama. It did not generate conflict, at least not conflict that reached the historical record. It generated distance, the kind of distance that becomes self-sustaining once it has been established long enough. Cornelia and her sons maintained contact, letters, occasional visits. the formal markers of a family relationship that had survived its most difficult period by reducing its demands. But the emotional substance of the relationship, the closeness that might have developed under different circumstances, was not recoverable from the particular shape their shared history had taken. John Cecil died in 1954. He had spent 30 years at Biltmore following his marriage to Cornelia. 30 years of increasingly devoted management of an estate he did not own, in a country that was not his birthplace, in service of a legacy that had absorbed his best energies and returned to him something that did not translate easily into conventional measures of success. He had not made a fortune. He had not acquired land or title. He had kept a house standing that would otherwise have fallen, and he had raised 2 sons who understood the obligation the house represented. His obituaries in the American press were respectful and somewhat surprised in their tone. The surprise of people who had expected a British second son to treat an American heiress's estate as a temporary arrangement, and who found themselves noting instead a man who had committed to the place with a permanence that exceeded what anyone had predicted. The Asheville papers covered his death with the warmth of a community that had watched him work for 3 decades and recognized the specific quality of that work. Cornelia did not make a public statement. Whether she attended his funeral is not clearly established in the available record. The marriage had been over for 20 years, the relationship reduced to its legal and parental dimensions long before his death. What she felt, what the death of the man she had left, the man who had stayed, the man who had raised her sons in the house she had walked away from, meant to her privately, is not something she left a record of. The estate's public narrative absorbed Cecil's death with the practical efficiency of an institution that had learned to manage change. The management responsibilities shifted incrementally to the next generation. George Cecil took on more formal oversight. William, still young, was being prepared for eventual involvement. The institutional continuity that Cecil had built was robust enough to survive the loss of its primary architect. Cornelia's legal ownership of the estate persisted unchanged through all of this. She owned it while Cecil managed it. She owned it while he died. She owned it while her sons began the process of taking over. The ownership was real in the formal sense and almost entirely abstract in every other sense. A legal condition that connected her to a place she no longer knew in any experiential way, that generated paperwork and financial distributions and occasional correspondence about decisions that were being made by other people. In England, through the 1960s, she painted. She maintained her social world. She lived by the available accounts quietly, the quietness of someone who has resolved, through the various pressures and losses of a long life, into a form of existence that is private by preference rather than accident. The Vanderbilt name, meanwhile, continued its slow recession from the center of American cultural memory toward its edges, where it would eventually settle as history. Significant, documented, permanently associated with a particular moment in the country's development, and finished. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt died on February 7, 1976, in London. She was 75 years old. The death was reported briefly in the American press, a paragraph in the New York Times, notices in a few other papers, the Asheville Citizen covering it with the slightly extended attention of a community that understood the name's local significance even after decades of disconnection. The obituaries were accurate and thin. They noted her birth, her parentage, her marriage to Cecil, the Biltmore estate, her subsequent life in England. They did not have much else to work with because she had not given them much else. A life conducted in private does not accumulate the public record that obituary writers depend on. She had outlived her first husband by 22 years. She had outlived her mother by 18 years. She had outlived by decades the social world that had produced her, the transatlantic aristocracy of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, the particular universe of managed marriages and dynastic estates and careful social performance that had structured her childhood and young adulthood. That world was gone. Most of its physical monuments were gone with it. The Newport cottages demolished or converted, the New York mansions replaced by apartment buildings, the whole apparatus of visible excess that had once defined the Vanderbilt identity reduced to museum exhibitions and history books. Biltmore was still standing. This was, by 1976, a fact that required acknowledgement as something other than obvious. The survival of a 250-room private house into the last quarter of the 20th century was not the natural outcome of anything. Houses of that scale, built for a mode of living that had ceased to be economically viable before the First World War, had been disappearing steadily since the 1920s. The calculation of maintenance cost against practical utility had been running against them for 50 years, and most of them had lost the calculation. Biltmore's survival was the result of specific decisions made by specific people under specific pressures. Cecil's decades of management, the conversion to commercial operation, the gradual development of a tourism model that generated enough revenue to justify the building's continued existence. Cornelia had owned the estate through all of it. She had owned it while Cecil managed it through the Depression. She had owned it while it opened to visitors. She had owned it while her sons grew up in it and eventually took over its management. She had owned it from a distance of several thousand miles for more than 40 years, receiving its financial distributions and providing its legal continuity while other people made the decisions that determined what it became. The estate passed, upon her death, to her sons, to George and William Cecil, who had been shaped by the place and had spent their adult lives in various degrees of engagement with its management and future. William Cecil in particular had developed by the 1970s a clear and ambitious vision for what Biltmore could become. A fully operational commercial enterprise, a destination, a business whose revenues could sustain the building indefinitely and whose growth could justify continued investment in its preservation. He had been moving toward this vision for years, and Cornelia's death removed the last legal complication that had kept the estate in its suspended condition. Owned by someone in England, managed by someone in North Carolina, the ownership and the operation never quite aligned. William Cecil moved forward. The Biltmore Company, as it eventually became known, developed through the late 1970s and 1980s into a serious commercial enterprise, expanding visitor programs, developing ancillary revenue streams, adding a winery that would become one of the estate's signature attractions, investing in the property's physical preservation with the resources that commercial success made available. The house was maintained, more than maintained. It was stabilized, restored in parts, sustained at a standard that the Depression-era economics of Cecil Sr.'s management had not been able to achieve. The result was that Biltmore survived, not as a private home. It had not been that in any meaningful sense since the 1930s, not as a family residence. The family connection was real, but had been thinning for generations. It survived as a business, a destination, a brand. The name Biltmore became, by the end of the 20th century, a commercial property, applied to hotels, to wine labels, to licensed products that carried the Vanderbilt Association as a mark of quality and historical prestige. George Vanderbilt had built the estate as a withdrawal from commerce. His descendants sustained it through commerce. The irony was complete and unremarkable. Unremarkable because it was simply what had been necessary, the pragmatic outcome of a situation in which the alternative to commercialization was loss. Cornelia's place in this story, as it came to be told officially by the estate and its associated materials, remained what it had been during her lifetime: the heir, the conduit, the legal link. The Biltmore narrative emphasized George's vision and Edith's stewardship, and Cecil's practical genius and William's entrepreneurial transformation. Cornelia appeared as a name in a genealogy, a face in a few photographs, the woman who had inherited the estate, and the narrative passed over this quickly, eventually passed it to the next generation. The passing over was not malicious. It was practical. The story the estate needed to tell about itself was a story of survival and preservation, of a great house maintained against the odds through devotion and ingenuity. Cornelia's actual story, the departure, the years in Europe, the private life conducted at a deliberate distance from everything her name represented, did not fit easily into that narrative. It raised questions the narrative preferred not to answer. Why had she left? What had the inheritance cost her? What does it mean that the woman who owned one of the most celebrated houses in America spent 4 decades not living in it? These questions do not have clean answers. They have the kind of answers that require sitting with discomfort. The recognition that wealth and possession and dynastic legacy can be forms of burden as much as forms of privilege, that the grandest house in America was, for the woman who owned it, something she needed to put an ocean between herself and in order to live. The house is still there. The visitors still come. Cornelia's name appears on the interpretive panels in its correct genealogical position. Her face looks out from the photographs in the expected places, the wedding, the family portraits, the carefully staged images of a life that was arranged around her without ever quite belonging to her. She left. The house remained. The distance between those two facts is where her story lives. Biltmore receives more than 1 million visitors a year now. They come through the front entrance, they move through the rooms in the way that the operation has designed for them. They look at the tapestries in the library and the banquet hall and the bedrooms, and they leave with photographs and wine and a sense of having encountered something genuinely extraordinary. The house is, by any measure, a success. It has survived everything. The financial pressures, the depression, the deaths, the departures, the long decades of uncertain economics. And it stands in the Blue Ridge Mountains, exactly as it was built, maintained to a standard that would have satisfied the man who commissioned it. George Vanderbilt's name is on the building in every sense that matters. His vision is what the tours describe. His library, his art, his architectural ambition, these are what people come to see. Cornelia's name is on a panel near the entrance. It gives her dates, her parentage, her marriage. It notes that she inherited the estate and that ownership eventually passed to her sons. It is accurate. It is also, in its careful brevity, a kind of answer to a question nobody is quite asking. What is not on the panel is the 40 years in England, the painting, the second marriage to a man she chose herself, the deliberate, sustained construction of a life whose primary quality was that it belonged to her rather than to a legacy, the ocean she kept between herself and the house that bore her family's name. None of this appears, because none of it fits the story the estate needs to tell about itself, and because Cornelia, in her lifetime, never offered it to anyone. She left no memoir, no extended interviews, no public account of what it had been like to grow up as the sole heir to the grandest private residence in America, to be married at 23 in a ceremony designed for 8,000 strangers, to leave 2 children in a house on another continent, and build something else entirely from what remained. The house kept everything she left behind. The rooms are preserved, the objects are maintained, the name is on the panel. What she took with her when she crossed the Atlantic, what she found on the other side, what the years in England actually gave her, whether any of it was enough, the record does not say.